Okay, so we got this biology textbook chapter all about animal behavior, and it's like you want us to really get into it, like all the big theories and research from instincts and learning all the way to how they communicate in their mating strategies. It's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, we're going to explore how animals react to everything around them and how their experiences change what they do, and some pretty incredible ways they've evolved to survive. And yeah, we can definitely look into how knowing all this stuff can help us out in the real world, too.
Yeah, let's go deep and figure out like the why behind all the crazy things animals do. And to start with the basics, how do scientists even begin to study something as complex as animal behavior?
Well, Nico Tinbergen, he's like a big name in the field, came up with this roadmap, basically 4 questions to ask about any behavior, and he split them up into what he called proximate causation, the how, and ultimate causation, the why.
So it's like asking, how does a behavior actually work?
Yeah.
Versus, why did this behavior evolve in the first place?
Exactly. Like take a male stickleback fish. These guys attack anything red in their territory. On the proximate side, we'd be asking, okay, how does its vision even pick up the color red and then trigger an attack? But on the ultimate side, we'd be asking, what evolutionary advantage does attacking red things even give it?
That's so cool. It's like looking at the same behavior through two totally different lenses. So what are some of the like basic types of behavior that almost all animals have?
Well, one of the most basic is what we call a fixed action pattern. It's an instinct, completely unlearned, and it's triggered by a super specific stimulus. Basically, it's like a hardwired response, doesn't need any learning or thinking.
Oh, so kind of like a reflex, but maybe way more complicated.
Exactly. Think of that stickleback we talked about, the red color. That's the trigger or the sign stimulus, and bam, the attack happens automatically.
Yeah.
These patterns are often super important for survival. Like when a moth hears a bat using echolocation to find it, it instantly does all these crazy maneuvers to dodge becoming dinner.
Wow, talk about high-stakes reflexes. Those fixed action patterns are like pre-programmed survival moves, all thanks to evolution.
Exactly. They really show how powerful natural selection is. Like it's shaping behavior at the most fundamental level.
Now, what about behaviors that are more complex, like migration? How do animals know where to go when they travel over such huge distances?
Migration is wild, right? They use a ton of different cues like the sun and the stars and even the Earth's magnetic field to find their way.
Wait, the Earth's magnetic field? Like they have some sort of internal compass?
You got it. Homing pigeons, for example, can navigate for hundreds of miles, and a big part of that is because they can sense the Earth's magnetic field.
That's insane. It's like they've got a built-in GPS.
Yeah.
Are there other things that come into play with these crazy long journeys?
Oh, for sure. They also have these internal biological clocks or rhythms that time their migrations perfectly, and these rhythms don't just control migration.
Like our sleep-wake cycle.
Exactly. That's a circadian rhythm, a daily cycle. But they also have circannual rhythms, yearly ones that influence migrations and when they reproduce. It's like this inner sense of timing they have, telling them when to migrate, when to mate, when to hibernate, all in sync with the seasons changing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's not just reacting to what's around them. There's this whole internal clock going on, too. Speaking of timing and responses, let's talk about how animals talk to each other. Like, how do they interact and share information?
Oh, man. Animal communication is a whole world of crazy and complex stuff. They use visual signals, chemical ones, touch, and sounds to get their messages across, and they often mix and match all these different ways.
So it's like a multisensory language, totally customized to their environment and how they live. For example, animals that are out and about at night would probably use smell and sound more than visual signals.
Exactly. The signals they evolve are totally tied to their specific needs. Let's dive into some examples, starting with how fruit flies do their courtship thing.
Ooh, fruit flies. Sounds a little messy.
It's actually super interesting. It's all about what we call a stimulus response chain, where each signal makes the other fly do something specific. The male starts by turning towards the female, and he's using smell to pick up pheromones, making sure she's the right species. Then he touches her with his leg. That's tactile communication. If she's into it, he'll spread his wing and vibrate it, making a courtship song.
So it's like a carefully choreographed dance, and the stakes are high. Every single step gives crucial information that leads to the next behavior in this whole intricate mating ritual.
You got it. And that's just one kind of communication. Chemical signals or pheromones are huge in all sorts of animal behaviors, from attracting mates to sending out warnings.
Okay, tell me more about these pheromones. They sound super powerful.
They are. Think about injured minnows. When they
Yeah.
get hurt, they release this alarm substance. It's a pheromone, basically, and it lets other minnows nearby know there's danger. They react by getting super cautious and hiding. It really shows how strong chemical communication can be.
Wow, it's like a chemical SOS that triggers a group defense mechanism. What other crazy communication stuff can we explore?
Let's get into something even more complex. Ready to talk about the honeybee's symbolic dance language?
Oh yeah, the bee dance. I've heard it's super intricate. Tell me everything.
It's mind-blowing, really. Honeybees use this dance to tell their hive mates where the good food is. So a forager bee finds a sweet spot, and when she gets back to the hive, she does this waggle dance on the honeycomb. The angle of her waggle run compared to the sun tells the other bees which direction to fly.
Wait, so the way they dance actually points to the food? That's wild.
Yeah, and get this, the longer she waggles, the farther away the food is.
So they're putting both direction and distance into their dance moves. That's some serious communication.
It really is. This dance language is so advanced, it's almost like symbolic communication, a code to share crucial information.
That just blows my mind. Seeing this kind of complexity in insects really makes you rethink how smart they are.
It definitely does. And that's just one example of the many ways animals communicate. It's intricate and often totally unexpected.
I'm already amazed by all these examples, and it seems like even the simplest behaviors are way more complicated than we think.
You're totally right. But we're just getting started. Next, we'll get into how experiences shape behavior, diving into the world of learning and cognition in animals. So we've been talking a lot about behaviors that are pretty much like pre-programmed, right? Like those fixed action patterns. But what about stuff that's shaped by what an animal goes through? That's where learning comes in.
Right. Animals aren't just robots acting on instinct. They learn and change how they act based on what happens to them throughout their lives. It's like they're constantly learning and getting better at dealing with the world around them.
Exactly. And one really cool way to study this is by doing what are called cross-fostering experiments.
Cross-fostering. I've never heard of that. What is that?
Basically, scientists raise the babies of one species with adults from a different species. It helps us see how the social environment affects behavior.
So it's kind of like a nature versus nurture experiment, but with animals? You're basically swapping out the parents to see how it changes the baby's behavior.
That's it. And the results are pretty amazing. They did this study with California mice, which are naturally aggressive, and white-footed mice, which are way more chill.
Okay, I'm curious now. What happened when they raised these two types of mice together?
Well, when they had California mice pups raised by white-footed mice parents, those pups grew up to be less aggressive than the ones raised by their own species. It just shows how much those early experiences, especially in a social setting, can really change an animal's behavior.
Wow, so being raised by the more peaceful white-footed mice actually changed how the California mice acted. That's really cool. It makes you think about nature versus nurture in us humans, too.
Absolutely. And it gets even more interesting. These changes in behavior were passed down to the next generation, too. So the less aggressive California mice, the ones raised by white-footed mice, their babies were also less aggressive, even though they were raised by other California mice.
Wait, are you saying that what happens to one generation can affect the behavior of the next generation? That's mind-blowing. It's like experiences can have a ripple effect, not just on individuals, but on whole families down the line.
Yeah, it's a super interesting area of research with some big implications. And speaking of how experiences influence behavior, let's talk about imprinting.
Imprinting. I've seen those videos of ducklings following people around like their mom. Is that imprinting?
Yep, perfect example. Imprinting happens early on in life. It's this crucial learning period where baby animals form a strong bond with a specific individual or object, usually a parent. It's how they learn basic behaviors and how to recognize their parents.
So those goslings in the videos have basically imprinted on a human and think they're their parent. It's cute, but it makes you wonder what happens to those animals in the long run. What if they don't imprint on the right individual?
That's when things get serious. If a baby doesn't imprint, the parent might not accept them, and the baby could die. It's super important for survival. But get this, scientists have actually figured out how to use imprinting to help with conservation efforts.
Really? That's surprising. How are they using imprinting to help endangered species?
A great example is with the whooping cranes. These birds are endangered, and to protect them and teach them their migration routes, conservationists raise them in captivity and use imprinting to guide them.
So how does that work? Do they, Dress up in whooping crane costumes and lead the chicks on their first migration?
It's not quite that dramatic, but there is some costume action. They used to use ultralight aircraft flown by people wearing crane suits to lead the young whooping cranes on their migration routes. The cranes would imprint on these parents and learn the way. But these days, they've moved towards methods that let the cranes be more independent and hopefully create self-sustaining crane populations.
That's incredible. It's amazing how understanding animal behavior can actually help us protect these amazing creatures. It's like taking all that textbook theory and putting it into action in the real world.
Exactly. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about another type of learning that's super important for survival. Spatial learning.
Spatial learning, is that like how I just automatically know how to get around my neighborhood without even thinking about it?
Exactly. It's the ability to learn and remember the layout of your surroundings, basically building a mental map in your head. Spatial learning is essential for animals to navigate their world, find food, find shelter, and avoid danger.
I bet it's especially important for animals that have really big territories or have to remember where they hid their food, like squirrels burying nuts for the winter.
You got it. And we can thank Nico Tinbergen, that pioneer we talked about earlier, for some of the first insights into spatial learning. He studied these digger wasps that make their nests in burrows. When a female wasp goes out to hunt, she covers the entrance with sand, but when she comes back, she flies straight back to her hidden burrow, even though there are tons of others around.
So how does she find her way back? Does she leave a scent trail or something?
That's what Tinbergen wanted to know. He thought that they used visual landmarks to remember where their nests were, so he tested his idea by moving stuff around the burrow entrances, like pine cones and pebbles.
Oh, so he messed with their surroundings. What happened? Did the wasps freak out?
They totally got confused. When he moved those landmarks, they couldn't find their nests anymore. They'd fly to the middle of where the landmarks were, even though their burrow was right there nearby. It was a simple experiment, but it showed that those wasps were definitely using visual cues to remember where their homes were.
So they were using those visual cues like a map to get back home. It's like they're taking pictures in their minds of what's around them. That's pretty impressive for a tiny wasp.
It is. It shows how tuned in animals are to their environment, paying attention to little details that we might miss. But some animals take spatial learning to a whole other level. They create what we call cognitive maps.
Cognitive maps, are those like mental maps we use to get around, but for animals?
You got it. It's like they have an image of their environment in their minds, a map they use to navigate and plan routes. Think about Clark's nutcrackers, these birds that hide thousands of pine seeds in different spots during the fall.
Whoa, that's a lot of seeds to remember. I can barely remember where I left my keys. How do those birds keep track of all those seeds?
They use their amazing cognitive maps. Studies have shown they can remember exactly where thousands of those hidden stashes are, even months later when they need them during the winter.
Their memory is crazy. It's like a GPS in their heads for all those hidden treasures.
It really is. It shows how some animals have these incredible mental abilities that go beyond just simple stimulus response stuff.
Okay, so we've got spatial learning and cognitive maps, both shaped by experience. What other kinds of learning are there in the animal world?
One of the most common and important ones is associative learning. It's basically connecting one thing in the environment with something else.
So it's like learning that a specific sound means there's food coming.
You got it. Like Pavlov's dogs. It's this classic experiment where they rang a bell every time right before giving the dogs food. Eventually, the dogs started connecting the bell with food and would start drooling just from hearing the bell, even if there wasn't any food around.
Right. Their brains were linking those two events together. They learned that the bell meant something good was coming food.
Exactly. That's what we call classical conditioning, where an animal learns to connect a random stimulus with a specific outcome. But there's also operant conditioning, where an animal learns to associate its own actions with a reward or a punishment.
Oh, like when I'm training my dog to sit, and I give him a treat when he does it right.
That's exactly operant conditioning. By connecting the action, sitting, with something good, the treat, your dog is more likely to sit again in the future.
Makes sense. It's all about connecting actions with consequences. So associative learning is super important for shaping animal behavior from insects all the way up to primates.
Totally. And while we like to separate instinctual behaviors from learned behaviors, it's important to remember that even learned behaviors often have a genetic component. For instance, white-crowned sparrows, they learn their songs in stages, memorizing their species song during a specific period early in life. But if they don't hear the song during that time, they won't develop the full adult song.
So it's like they're genetically programmed to learn a specific kind of song, but they still need to hear it to get it right.
Exactly. It shows how nature and nurture work together. Genes provide the blueprint, and experiences fill in the details.
It reminds us that even the most complicated behaviors often come from both genes and environment, the kind of beautiful dance between nature and nurture.
Well said. And this complexity makes studying animal behavior so fascinating. It challenges what we think we know and reveals just how diverse the natural world really is.
I'm totally hooked. But before we move on, I have a question. We've talked about animals learning from their own experiences, good and bad, but can they learn from each other? Like, can they watch other animals and copy what they do?
Great question. And the answer is yes. That's called social learning. Animals learn by watching and imitating others. It's a really efficient way to learn new skills and information without having to go through all the trial and error
That
themselves.
makes a lot of sense. I bet that's super important for animals living in big, complex social groups. Got any cool examples of social learning in action?
One of the best known examples is with chimps. Young chimps learn how to crack nuts open using stones by watching the experienced adults and copying them. It's almost like a cultural tradition they pass down through the generations.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like they have their own societies with their own customs and traditions, just like humans. They're not just learning about the physical world, they're learning from each other, building on the knowledge of those who came before them.
Exactly. It's a way to pass down information that shapes how everyone in the group behaves. And there's another fascinating example with vervet monkeys. They have different alarm calls for different predators, distinct calls for leopards, eagles, and snakes.
So they have specific sounds to warn each other about different threats.
Yeah.
That's amazing. It's like they have a whole vocabulary for communicating danger.
Right. And what's cool is that the young vervets start by giving these alarm calls randomly. They might give the eagle alarm for any bird they see, even harmless ones. But they learn through social cues by watching how the adults in their group react, and eventually they get better at giving the right calls for the right threats.
So they're not born knowing these specific alarm calls. They learn by paying attention to the adults in their group.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how interacting with others shapes behavior, helping them fine-tune their responses so they're more effective. This whole exploration of animal learning has been amazing. From imprinting to cognitive maps to social learning, it's clear that animals are way more adaptable and intelligent than we often think.
I'm totally blown away by all these examples. We've gone from those basic pre-programmed instincts to these intricate forms of learning and even this cultural transmission of information.
And we've only just begun to explore this vast and ever-changing field of animal behavior. There's still so much more to discover and understand about the fascinating ways animals interact with their world and with each other.
Well, I'm officially hooked on animal behavior, but now I'm thinking about how all these behaviors we've talked about actually play out in an animal's chances of survival and reproduction. It's one thing to understand how behaviors work, but how do they actually work in the real world, in the struggle for survival?
That's a great question, and it takes us into the really cool world of behavioral ecology, where we look at the evolutionary forces that shape behavior, specifically how behaviors help an animal survive and reproduce successfully.
Okay, so now we're going beyond the how of behavior and getting into the why.
Yeah.
I'm ready to jump into this behavioral ecology world. Let's explore how behaviors actually translate into success in the game of life. Okay, so we're back and ready to dig into the why behind all this animal behavior stuff. We've learned about how instincts and learning work, but now it's time to get into behavioral ecology and see how these behaviors actually help an animal survive and make more babies out in the real world.
Exactly. It's not just about how behaviors work, but how they affect an animal's fitness. Because at the end of the day, surviving and reproducing those are the things that matter most in evolution.
Right. So where do we start with this behavioral ecology thing? What are some of the key areas that researchers focus on?
Well, one of the most basic things is foraging. You know how animals find and get their food? It might seem simple, but the strategies they use to get a meal can be super complex and have a huge impact on whether they survive or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. Food is like the most important thing. So the ones who are better at finding it and doing it efficiently, they're going to have a big advantage.
You got it. And a really cool example comes from studies on fruit flies. You know those tiny little bugs that are always buzzing around? They've actually taught us a lot about how foraging behavior evolves.
Okay, I'm listening. What have scientists learned from these little fruit flies?
There's this gene called forager, or for short, and it influences how far a fruit fly larva will travel when it's looking for food. There are two main versions of this gene, for RR, which stands for rover, and for Oz, which means sitter.
So some larvae are basically programmed to wander farther than others. It's like they have different personalities, the adventurous rovers and the stay-at-home sitters.
That's a great way to put it. And what's really interesting is that how common these two gene versions are can change depending on how many flies there are in the population.
Really, so the environment can affect which version of the gene is more common.
Exactly. They did these experiments where they kept fruit fly populations at low numbers for a bunch of generations, and what happened? The sitter gene 4s became way more common. But when they had these super crowded high density populations, the rover gene 4R was the one that took over.
Wow, that's like evolution in action.
Hmm.
When things are crowded and food is scarce, it makes sense that those adventurous rovers would have an advantage. They're the ones more likely to find food and survive and pass on their rover genes to the next generation.
That's exactly it. It's a classic example of natural selection doing its thing, picking out the best traits for whatever environment the animal is in. And this brings us to this idea called the optimal foraging model, which helps us understand how natural selection shapes the way animals find food.
Okay, tell me more about this optimal foraging model.
So the basic idea is that animals should evolve to use foraging strategies that get them the most energy with the least amount of effort.
Makes sense. It's all about being efficient, getting the most food for your energy buck.
Exactly. But the costs aren't just about how much energy they use. There's also the risk of getting eaten. Because a really good foraging strategy isn't just about finding food, it's about staying alive to eat it.
True. Sometimes the best food sources might also be the most dangerous places to be.
Yeah, for sure. And a perfect example of this balancing act is something we see in northwestern crows. They love eating these tough-shelled sea snails called whelks, and they have this cool trick for getting at the good stuff inside.
Oh yeah, I think I've seen videos of this. They fly up high and drop the whelks onto rocks to break them open.
That's it. But the crazy part is that they don't just drop them from any old height. They seem to choose this specific height that's like the sweet spot for breaking the shell without wasting too much energy flying up.
So it's not just random. They're actually making decisions about how high to fly.
It seems like it. Scientists have watched them and seen that they pretty much always drop the whelks from about 5 meters. And when they tested dropping them from different heights, they found that 5 meters was the most efficient. It's the best height for breaking the shell while still saving energy.
That's wild. Those crows are basically solving a physics problem, figuring out the perfect height to drop those shells. It's like they have this little calculator in their heads that's telling them this is the height for the best results.
It's incredible, right? It really shows how powerful natural selection is shaping even these seemingly simple behaviors to make them super efficient.
This whole idea of optimal foraging is blowing my mind. It's like we're getting a sneak peek into the evolutionary forces that have created all these complex ways animals find food. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about another important part of survival and reproduction, mating.
Good one. Food might be essential for survival, but mating, that's all about passing on your genes to the next generation, making sure your lineage keeps going.
Right. And there's so much variety and weirdness in how animals do it. I'm curious about all the different mating systems out there. Like, why do some animals stay with one partner their whole lives while others play the field?
It's mind-blowing how much diversity there is. One big factor that determines mating systems is how much care the offspring need.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
If the babies are helpless and need constant attention, both parents being involved would be the best bet.
exactly. In those cases, monogamy, where one male mates with one female, is often the best strategy. It lets both parents share the work of raising those vulnerable babies, giving them the best chance of survival.
Okay, but what about species where the babies are more independent? Like if they can take care of themselves pretty soon after they're born, does that change the mating game?
Oh, yeah, definitely. In those situations, you often see polygamy evolving, where one individual mates with multiple partners. There are two main types. Polygyny, where one male has multiple female partners, and polyandry, where it's one female with multiple males.
So it's like this whole range of mating strategies from the exclusive monogamy to the more open-minded world of polygamy.
Exactly. And polygyny is way more common in nature. It often happens because males are competing like crazy for mates, and because females typically put more energy into making and raising babies.
That makes sense. If the females are doing most of the parenting, the males are free to focus on spreading their genes around.
Precisely. And this difference in how much each parent invests in the offspring can lead to what we call sexual dimorphism, where the males and females of a species look totally different.
Like the classic example of peacocks with those huge flashy tails. The males are all about standing out while the females are much more low-key.
Exactly. When you have a polygynous species where the males are competing for multiple females, they often evolve these elaborate ornaments or displays to try to attract those females.
It's like they're saying, hey, look at me, I have the best genes. It's all about showing off their fitness to potential mates.
You got it. Think about male frigate birds. They have this bright red throat pouch that they puff up to attract females. The bigger and brighter the pouch, the more attractive the male. But sexual selection isn't just about how you look, it can also affect how you act.
So it's not just about being pretty, it's about having the right moves, too.
For sure. Think about those elaborate courtship dances birds of paradise do, or the crazy fights male elephant seals have to show who's dominant and gets access to the females.
Wow, so sexual selection's a powerful thing. It affects both how animals look and how they act, driving the evolution of all sorts of interesting traits and strategies.
Totally. But it's not just the males who are calling the shots in this mating game. Females also have a lot of power through mate choice.
Right. I bet females aren't just sitting around accepting any male that comes their way. They're probably checking out potential mates and looking for specific qualities.
Absolutely. Females are often really picky about who they mate with. They might choose males based on their health, how well they can provide resources, or even how good they'll be at parenting. It's not just about having good genes, it's about finding a partner who will help make sure their offspring are successful.
So they want more than just a handsome face or a fancy dance. They're looking for a good provider and a good dad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we see some really cool examples of this choosiness all over the animal kingdom. Like studies on zebra finches have shown that females actually prefer males who are raised by dads with ornaments.
Dads with ornaments, what do you mean?
So in this experiment, scientists took some male zebra finches and gave them these fake red feather ornaments. Then they watched to see what kind of males their daughters preferred. And guess what? Those daughters preferred males who also had ornaments.
So it's like they learned from their dads what a good mate should look like. That's amazing how these early experiences can affect their mating decisions later on.
It really shows how genes and experience work together to determine who animals choose to mate with. But before we wrap up, I want to talk about one more thing: altruism.
Altruism. Those selfless actions that benefit someone else, even if it means sacrificing something yourself. It seems kind of backwards when you think about survival of the fittest.
I know, right? Altruism stumped scientists for a long time. How could behaviors that seem to hurt an individual's chances of survival and reproduction actually evolve?
Yeah. If evolution is all about making sure you pass on your own genes, why would you do something that could put you at risk?
Well, that's where inclusive fitness comes in. It expands our understanding of fitness beyond just an individual's own reproductive success.
So inclusive fitness takes the bigger picture into account. It's not just about your own offspring, but about how well your relatives do too.
Exactly. Inclusive fitness recognizes that your relatives share a lot of your genes, so helping them survive and reproduce can indirectly increase the chances of your own genes being passed on, even if you don't have any kids yourself.
So even if you're making sacrifices, you can still increase your genetic legacy by helping those who share your genes. It's like a whole family effort.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads to the idea of kin selection, where natural selection favors altruistic behaviors that benefit close relatives.
So the closer you are related to someone, the more likely you are to help them out. It's like those bumper stickers that say, I break for squirrels, especially my cousins.
Uh-huh. Well, there's some truth to that. A classic example is alarm calling in Belding's ground squirrels. When one of them spots a predator, they often make this high-pitched alarm call to warn everyone else in the area.
But doesn't that put the squirrel who's making the call in more danger? They're basically announcing themselves to the predator.
You're right, it does make them more vulnerable. But here's the interesting part. Female squirrels are way more likely to give alarm calls than males. And this makes sense when you consider that females usually live closer to their relatives than males do.
So when a female squirrel gives the alarm, she's more likely to be warning her own family members, increasing her inclusive fitness, even if it puts her at risk.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how altruism can evolve through kin selection, helping your relatives ultimately benefits your shared genes.
This whole concept of inclusive fitness is really changing how I think about the evolution of behavior. It's not just about individuals competing with each other. It's about the success of the family unit, ensuring that those shared genes get passed on.
And while kin selection explains a lot of altruistic behavior, there's also something called reciprocal altruism, where individuals who aren't related help each other out with the understanding that the favor will be returned later on.
So it's like the whole you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours thing, but in the animal world.
That's a great way to think about it. This type of altruism is more common in social animals that live in stable groups where they're constantly interacting and can remember who's helped them in the past.
It's like a social agreement built on trust and reciprocity. If you're known as someone who helps others out, they'll be more likely to help you when you need it.
Exactly. And we see a really cool example of this in vampire bats.
Vampire bats, really? Those little bloodsuckers?
Yeah.
They don't exactly seem like the altruistic type.
I know, right? But surprisingly, they are. Vampire bats need to drink blood to survive, and if one of them can't find any food, they might beg for some from a bat they roost with. And those roost mates will often share, but not with just anyone. They're more likely to share with bats who have shared with them in the past.
So they're keeping track of who's a good sharer. It's like they have this system of favors within their bat colony.
It's a fascinating example of how reciprocal altruism can evolve even in places you might not expect. It shows how important social bonds and cooperation are for survival, even in species we might not think of as being very social.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. From those basic instincts to all the complex stuff about learning mating strategies and even altruism, we've uncovered so much about the cool ways animals get by in the world.
And we've really only just scratched the surface. The study of animal behavior is constantly evolving, uncovering new things about the amazing diversity and complexity of life on Earth.
It really makes you realize that we're all connected, sharing this planet with all these creatures who have their own unique ways of surviving and thriving. It's a field of study that's both humbling and inspiring, constantly challenging our ideas about intelligent social behavior and what it means to be alive.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And the more we learn about animal behavior, the more we understand not only about the natural world, but also about ourselves and how we fit into the bigger picture.
This has been an incredible journey exploring these fascinating behaviors and uncovering the secrets of the animal kingdom. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure to share all this with you. Until next time, keep your eyes open, keep learning, and keep being amazed by the incredible world of animal behavior. Who knows what other incredible discoveries are out there just waiting to be found?